Hi everyone, my name's Darryl Panes, CEO at As Good as Gold Australia, and today once again I'm joined by my brother Brian.
Good morning, Darryl.
And partner at As Good as Gold. And today we interviewed John Adams, Chief Economist at As Good as Gold Australia. Good morning, John.
Good morning, John.
Good morning, Darryl and Brian. How are you today?
We're very well after a hectic night.
It was an interesting night,
Darryl. It was an interesting night. I mean, Russia, of course, has invaded Ukraine. That all intensified last night. All hell broke loose so far as precious metals were concerned. They reacted sharply, and then it was just fluctuations went crazy in the pricing of metals. So I don't know I don't know if you could stand that night after night after night.
No, you wouldn't want it to happen too many times. But it's back to normal this morning.
Yeah.
I did see that gold is up in US dollars back to 1906 when I left home.
Yes.
So it's I rather a slower progress than an up and down progress because it's just a lot more stability.
Yeah.
But it's definitely going in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, I've got to say welcome back, John. It's been some time since we spoke to John last. It was towards the end of last year, so it's been a couple of months since we spoke, and a great deal has happened in that time. But I think the most important thing is that because we didn't connect with John in December, so far as interviews were concerned, I think we go back to 2021 and just have a look at John's assessment as to what transpired over the final stages of 2021, and then if we can go into 2022, you're an assessment on what you're seeing right now in the new year, John.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Darryl. What I think is really important for our clients and the people watching this video is to understand the context in terms of where we are. So, the last 2 years has been perhaps the two most horrendous years since perhaps World War II in terms of the impact on in terms of society, in terms of the economy, in terms of civil rights. A lot of people have gone through enormous turmoil around the world, and we've obviously seen a lot of violent reaction by protesters, whether it's here in Australia or in Canada or in parts of Europe, etc. So, my general feeling is that I think we're in a very dark place, both politically, economically, and so in terms of socially. And to be honest, there doesn't seem to be a lot of bright rays of sunshine coming through. Without sort of going into the COVID area too much, one would hope that we're past the worst of the restrictions. We are starting to see, particularly here in New South Wales, we are in very much starting today actually with a removal of mask mandates. We're really very close back to 2019 pre-pandemic conditions, but obviously politicians have given themselves enormous leeway to bring these restrictions back in whenever they see fit, and that obviously creates a lot of economic uncertainty about obviously business and businesses and individuals. They need to plan their careers, their businesses. They need certainty about what are the rules of the game, and politicians keep on changing their mind, and that has created a lot of disruption, and a lot of people have suffered in the process. So when we look at the global picture, Darryl, only in the last 18 hours did the International Institute of Finance come out and say that global debt hit a record at the end of 2021 at $303 trillion. Now, in 2020, a lot of that growth of debt, which was about 30 trillion, was driven by developed economies like Australia, US, UK, etc. And last year, it was actually developing economies that actually saw a sharp rise in debt. So the global picture is we've got a world that is drowning in even more debt compared to 2019 in terms of before we went into the pandemic. The financial market is a lot more fragile. We have stagflation at the moment, and if our viewers recall, I think in 2020 I came out and said we will we were seeing stagflation then, and the evidence is abundantly clear around the world. If you look at, say, the consumer price index in the United States, inflation is at about 7.5% year on year. We've had elevated rates of inflation in Australia. I think last year was 3.5% in terms of inflation, and the inflation story has obviously been the talk of the financial markets. And obviously, what inflation means is that not only are asset prices going through the roof, like real estate and commodities and shares and etc., but the cost of living that's also going up. And one of the interesting things in the Australian context is this week we saw the release of wages growth by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and wages growth came out on a yearly basis came out at about 2.3%. So when we think about if inflation's at 3.5%. And wages only grow by 2.3%. Well, real wages, when you take into account inflation, actually went down by 1.2%. And one of the things I will say is that even though wages growth went up 2.3% in the last year, a lot of that growth was actually due to public sector wage increases. And the picture in the private sector in terms of Australia, I mean, that is a lot worse. So when you have inflation rising faster than wages, obviously, what that means is middle-class families are getting squeezed. And when you look at, for example, Martin North's financial stress data, mortgage stress is still at record levels, so is rental stress. And a lot of Australians are suffering financially quite hard. And when we look at the amount of, say, household debt that people have racked up in the last 2 years, and a lot of that debt has been racked up because of extraordinary fiscal and monetary policy, and then last year in particular during the lockdown, a lot of people were very fearful of if they don't buy now that they won't be able to get into the market, and that's this psychological phenomena of the fear of missing out, or FOMO, that drove prices quite heavily. And I did speak to real estate agents in my local area, and they said that was definitely a big factor as to why people were aggressively bidding in the market. And there was only an article yesterday, I think, in the Financial Review that said 70% of first-time buyers in the major eastern capital cities like Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane cannot afford to get into the market. So people are struggling with rent. People can't buy a house. We've got stagnant wages, and obviously that leads to a huge level of financial stress. And that with that financial stress, and I don't know that a lot of relationships have been sort of tested in the last 2 years in the context of the pandemic. That has created a lot of social and emotional and mental health heartache for millions of people across the country. And dare I say that for a lot of people, 2021, 2022 is a worse place in terms of their lives compared to where we were in 2019. Now, so obviously there are people like you and in terms of the both of you, and in terms of myself, because we were sort of trying to warn people in 2018 and 2019 that we all needed to get our financial house in order. I think the three of us have been able to weather the storm quite well. But unfortunately for millions of people who are susceptible to mainstream media propaganda, particularly when it comes to economics, they have really gone through the cleaner in the last 24 months.
John, it has been a incredible couple of years. I just to reiterate that the houses in Adelaide in the last 2 years are up 32% on average. And you talk about inflation at 3.5%, wages of growth at 2.3%. How on earth young people are going to be able to get out that extra loan? Because that's the only way they're going to do it. If a house price has gone up by 32%, they're going to have to take a bigger loan out. Then it's not just the inflation; it's the amount of what the repayments are. So I think we're in a bit of a pickle. Anyway, I want to go on to the next question, John. Look, in recent weeks, you have provided an updated macroeconomic forecast for the Australian economy for the coming 2 years. Can you share your thoughts, please? I really want to know those 2 years, about what's happening in those 2 years.
Thank you for the question, Brian. There's been a lot of speculation as to what is going to happen in the financial markets, but also in terms of the Australian economy. And there's various commentators on YouTube talking about a stock market crash and a financial crisis and basically Armageddon is coming very soon. There's a few points to make, and obviously I think in the Australian context it's very good, Brian. You mentioned property, because property is at the heart of the debt bubble that we have here in Australia. So the main point I think that Australians need to understand is that our leadership, and I'm very critical of our leadership here in Australia, but around the world, particularly in Western countries, the powers that be are not suicidal, and they're not kamikaze. And I think that this is the central point that people need to understand when you're trying to understand what's going to happen with the economy in terms of the financial markets. At the end of the day, this is not really, in my view, about economics. It's about politics. And if we were to go through a major deflationary financial crisis like the type that Harry Dent and others mentioned, this will effectively destroy the political power of the powers that be. So, and obviously in the Australian context, the housing bubble, that 60% of all lending by banks are into the housing market. So if the housing market were to crash, that would mean that the banks would go, and if the banks went, that would destroy the economy. The politicians would be basically turfed out, and obviously the senior bureaucrats at the leading government institutions like the RBA and APRA and ASIC and Treasury, what they call the Council of Financial Regulators. I mean, their credibility will be shot and they'll basically be turfed out. So at the end of the day, and even though I've just sort of made those comments in the context of Australia, it is very true around the world. And even though we see all of this political theater between the Russians and the Americans, etc., no one wants a crash of the financial system, because it would be the most horrific economic event in world history. And the reason why is because we've got the biggest debt bubble ever seen in the history of the human species. So we, in terms of, with that in mind, now we're obviously, with inflation raging, we're hearing this talk about policy normalization and in terms of the increasing interest rates. So now, a few weeks ago, the Reserve Bank of Australia said that they were going to end quantitative easing, and that happened on the 10th of February. The US Federal Reserve has been signaling that they're going to start to raise rates in terms of March. Now, there could well be increases in interest rates, and if there are increases in interest rates, because so many households, particularly in Australia, have taken on so much new debt in the last 2 years, that is really going to impact them. But I do think that the central point to make is that they will not raise interest rates to the level that they will allow the system to crash. And even last week, when the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia was in front of the Australian Senate at Senate estimates, he basically said our intention is not to crash the economy. So now, if we think about where, for example, the official cash rate was in 2019, the RBA set it at 1.5%, and then they took it down to 0.1, and then they did all these other extraordinary measures like yield curve control and quantitative easing and a whole host of other things. They cannot go back in terms of interest rates to where we were in 2019, because to go back to 1.5% that would crash the economy. So there's only a limited amount of space that policymakers can normalize policy, and it could well be in the Australian context that the cash rate goes up to 0.75%, 1%. Now, having said that, the RBA has said that they have no intention of raising interest rates in 2022, and it could well be into 2023 when they raise rates. And there's a lot of commentary this week that, given that wages growth was quite weak, that gives the RBA even more time to delay any increases in terms of interest rates. But when the interest rate increases do come, I think they're going to be very small, very marginal, and because they are because they'll be sort of small, that will have enormous impacts on in terms of the Australian economy. A lot of Australians last year, and what I'm about to say sort of really doesn't make a lot of financial sense to me, is a lot of people who sign mortgages. And what I'm about to say is sort of borne out by research by Martin North, is people don't think about paying off the mortgage. People think, can I afford the mortgage repayments today based on my circumstances today? And so what we're seeing is a lot of people are making short-term cash flow decisions and not thinking about, well, what happens if my circumstances change, and how am I ever going to pay back this debt? So that's why we saw extraordinary sums of money being borrowed last year by a whole range of households. And so interest rates only have to go up marginally for households to be in significant financial trouble. And that trouble would mean a very weak property sector. It would mean that household consumption, that would start to fall. And because we have an economic growth model based on debt, that means that economic growth would weaken quite substantially. So the bigger the bubble, you need a smaller pin to prick it. And so that's why I think in the next couple of years we will see a small amount of interest rate increases, and then when the economy starts to slow, that's when they're going to reverse course again, and they're going to start to cut rates. Now, while a lot of people were focused on COVID in 2021, in terms of the economy, the big story was what came out of APRA. So APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, in July of last year, published draft expectations for negative interest rates, and then they published their final expectations in October. And they said by October 2022, they expect all Australian financial institutions to have so-called tactical solutions that the banks could implement, or the banks will have ready to implement when negative interest rates, if negative interest rates were to come. So in 2019, the RBA said that it was unlikely that we would ever see negative interest rates in Australia, and here we are in 2022, and the banks are preparing solutions for of how to make negative interest rates work in terms of their products, in terms of their IT systems, in terms of their communications with customers, etc. So I think in terms of where we're headed, I think APRA really let the cat out of the bag, and we will see negative interest rates, not this year, but I think probably in about 2024 we will see negative interest rates when we have to start cutting. We have to loosening in terms of fiscal and monetary policy. So now, when we think about, so we saw extraordinary sums of money being borrowed last year, when mortgage rates were at about 1.9 to 2.4%, and like I just said, people are borrowing on a short-term basis. Can I afford the repayment today? Well, if we see negative interest rates in 2024, dare I say, I think we'll see mortgage rates at about 1%. So they probably could be half of what they were last year. And with mortgage rates of 1%, there'll be a whole host of Australians who will, again, on a short-term cash flow basis, go out and borrow even larger sums of money. And I think that's going to drive property prices even higher, probably in the next 2 years. Now, a lot of banks and market analysts are saying something very completely different, but there is no real solution to getting out of the pickle that we have. The reason why we had the global financial crisis in 2008 was because, driven by Alan Greenspan, but also other central banks, we raised rates too high. So we had an inflation problem in, say, 2004, 5, 6, and then Greenspan raised interest rates too high, and that crashed the American housing market. And within 18 months, that led to the global financial crisis in 2008. And policymakers have basically said, well, we're not going to repeat that. And anytime there is a opportunity for a financial crisis or for the system to come crashing down. They come rushing out trying to save the system. So if we think about, say, August, September of 2019, we had the repo crisis, and they pumped in about $750 billion to basically save the banks. And that then led into the pandemic. And then in March 2020, they announced QE to infinity. I mean, that was basically what world central banks said in a coordinated statement. And really, we can't go back. I mean, that's kind of why I was saying in 2019 and early 2020 that we shouldn't go down this path, that the path we're on, because we can't go back. And I would have actually allowed for a deep recession or a depression to occur 2 years ago, because the pain would be a lot less than if we went through a financial crisis today. So when people start to think about, well, where's things are going, how safe are the markets, how safe are the banks, what is the direction going forward? I think the key point is it's politics, it's not economics. The elite are not suicidal. They're going to try to hold power in terms of whatever way they can. And ultimately what that's going to mean is that they're just going to keep on printing more and more money to keep this bubble going. And that's obviously going to inflame stagflationary forces probably in terms of the next 2 years. So when I think about that scenario and what it means for precious metals, I mean, I do think that the macroeconomic picture for the next 24 months to 36 months is very rosy, purely because there is no intention by anyone to allow the system to crash.
Incredible. John, with all those points that you raised, and the mind is ticking and points are going through, and I wrote down a few, and Darryl, I think you would agree. I mean, I can't see any better solution economic plan than the gold standard. I've always said it, but these are the points I raise. I go back to the 1922-24. John Maynard Keynes made some serious moves and said, look, we can get ourselves out of trouble by printing more money. Sure, we have to pay it back, but that will create the GDP will grow and we'll be able to pay it back. But that has never happened, and it still exists today. We cannot seem to be able to pay back the debt. I know the reasons why, but we won't go into it on this occasion. We mentioned negative interest rates. Negative interest rates, that will mean that the person out there that's on a pension or on a long-term, they finish work, they've retired, they want to use what they've got in the bank, well, they're not going to get any interest. Absolutely none in the bank account. So that really is an awful situation. 7.5% inflation, well, look, it may come down, but the way I see it, 7.5% inflation and wages are growing at 2.3%, you're really in a rock and a hard place. And again, I reiterate, housing in Adelaide, 32% over 2 years. I mean, you can have all the wage rises in history. It's not going to cater for the amount of rises in the real estate market, and of course the stock market is also has accumulated a lot of debt as well. You know, the shares might be up, but at the end of the day, the standard of living is down. Darryl?
Valid points.
Yep.
I was sitting at dinner last Sunday night with a very good friend of mine. We hadn't connected for some time, mainly because of COVID. But one of the questions they asked very early in the evening, there were many questions and we covered all of them except for this one. When I was asked the question about the coming election and who we were going to vote for. And we revisited this question, John, on 3 or 4 occasions and kept saying, well, we haven't answered that question yet. In the past, and it was as if we were trying to avoid it. That was the inference. But in the past, you would have very definite views about who you were going to vote for. And the gentleman I was sitting with his wife, are very intelligent people. They hadn't made up their mind. I hadn't made up my mind. And I think a lot of people are in the same position at the moment, just saying, who is worthy of our vote? Who's going to stand up and represent this country in the manner that we would expect? So I've got a question for you, John. I wish you'd been at our dinner table the other night. You might have made things a little bit easier. But in the coming months, of course, Australia will go to a federal election. Given that you used to work in Parliament, I'd like your assessment on the upcoming election and the implications it's going to have, the result of that, the implications it's going to have on the economy.
What I'll do, Darryl, is I'll give you my assessment, and I'm very interested to compare my assessment to what you told your friends in terms of your dinner on Sunday night. But really, I do think that if we just talk about in terms of the politics first, I am expecting a bit of a bombshell in the Senate. So I think we are going to see a big swing to the minor parties, and some of those minor parties will include, say, the United Australia Party, the Liberal Democrats, One Nation, and there will be a few other, no doubt, minor parties like that who took a very different view compared to the coalition, Labor and the Greens, in terms of how to manage the pandemic. So I am expecting to see more crossbench senators, and those senators, I think, will hold the balance of power. So now I have declared my position publicly about who I'm going to vote for, and I'll be voting for some of these minor parties. Now, in terms of the lower house, so the polling doesn't suggest that we're going to see minor parties pick up seats in the House of Representatives. So, I was in Canberra only a couple of weeks ago when I did the rounds, and I spoke to 3 coalition senators and MPs, and the mood on the backbench is very dire. One of them said to me that in the course of modern political history, there's only been 3 prime ministers that were 10 points down in the polls on a two-party preferred basis that actually came back to win. One of them was Howard in 2001. One of them was Keating in 1993, and the politician couldn't remember the third occasion. But in all of these occasions where the prime minister was able to turn the polls around, they had 12 months, and it took them 12 months to turn the public sentiment around. Well, unfortunately for Scott Morrison, here we are in late February, and everyone's expecting the election to be in May, and the coalition's still way down on the polls, and I don't think they have enough time to recover. So I think that it's either going to be a majority Labor government, or it could be a minority government, and it'll be up to Morrison or Albanese to negotiate in terms of the crossbench. So there will be there'll be a number of independents in the lower house, and dare I say, I think Labor will probably have the edge in terms of negotiating a deal so they can form a minority government. So I think the safe thing to assume is Morrison won't return, given how down he is in the polls, and given that he doesn't have enough time to turn things around. So that's my political assessment. Now, when it comes to the economics, I mean, ultimately, the Prime Minister is really not in charge of the economy. I mean, it's ultimately, so this Council of Financial Regulators, which is basically the RBA and the other economic agencies like Treasury, ASIC, and APRA, they and the banks are basically running they're running the they're running the ship in terms of where fiscal and monetary policy go, because they're the ones in charge of keeping this debt bubble going and stopping the housing market from crashing, which would, like I said before, it would crash the financial system and in terms of the Australian banks. So I think no matter who is the Prime Minister, the debt bubble isn't going to go away. We will still continue to have stagflation. They really can't do anything about it unless if they're willing to crash the economy, and neither Morrison or Albanese are willing to do that. So everyone is, encouraging low interest rates. Everyone's encouraging, significant amounts of spending. We heard all this rhetoric by the coalition about, in terms of having a surplus. Well, there is no plan for a surplus, even if you look at the projections. So, in terms of the next budget will be handed down on the 29th of March. And I don't think we're going to get, a very honest assessment about the state of the books. I think we're going to see a very political document that's going to be framed about trying to convince Australians to vote for the coalition. So, but even if you look at, say, a number of these state governments, now I think the Western Australian government has delivered a surplus, and I think they have, because of strong commodity prices. WA has a strong projection of being able to run sound finances in terms of their government, but particularly in terms of the eastern states, Queensland, Victoria, and in terms of New South Wales, but also in terms of the ACT. I mean, these state governments are just running a red ink, and they've been running a red ink for a large part, as well as with the federal government, because the RBA has been buying about 30% of the bonds through their quantitative easing program. Now, like I said before, that program has now stopped, and that should mean that bond rates should go up probably over the next 3 to 6 months, which would, in theory, make it more expensive for governments to borrow more money. But dare I say that, as kind of like what I was saying before, I do think that in the next 24 months, we will come to a point where the economy starts to weaken too much, and we will start to reverse course and start to inject more stimulus into the system. And I think we will see, whether it's the second half of 2023 or early 2024, not only negative interest rates, but I think we'll see a resumption of quantitative easing. And that quantitative easing will obviously allow the government of the day, whether it's the federal government or the state governments, it will allow them to be able to spend more money. So yes. So I think now, a lot of people want a clear change of direction of the government. I don't think we're going to see that change with either, the four big parties, which is Liberal, National, Labor, or Green. So unless if enough Australians say, well, we're going to throw the established parties and really vote for these minor parties, I mean, that's the only way we're going to see a dramatic change in the direction of the economy. But short of that, which I don't expect to happen in the House of Representatives, I think it's very much steady as she goes. And kind of like what I said before, I think we will see more stagflation. I think middle class Australians will continue to struggle over the next 2 years, irrespective of the federal election outcome. And obviously, for those who don't want to see further financial hardship, I mean, it's kind of like we've been banging this drum ever since I joined As Good as Gold Australia in 2018. Everyone has to make deliberate choices to put their own economic house in order, because if you don't, you suffer the consequences.
Yeah, in the end, I think it just gets back to us, because we're going to see more of the same, as John has just said. So you've got to make some decisions for yourself. You can't be reliant upon, and you really should never have been reliant upon a government to make decisions for you, how you want to run your life. No, so we've got to stand up.
Yeah,
basically.
You do got to keep government out of your life.
That's
exactly right. John, I have a very quick question, my last question, we'll follow on with what's in front of us right now. But the question is, what's been happening in Canada over the last couple of weeks? We have seen a massive protest in Canada by the truck drivers and others. The Canadian government has passed through legislation that enables them to close down bank accounts of those protesters. Now, well, I will admit that law has now been retracted, but the question is, could we see the same thing in Australia?
Of course. So I mean, one of the things that I remember speaking with Martin North about in 2019, and I think we spoke about it in one of our interviews, is that all bank customers should read their terms and conditions of their deposit account. So these terms and conditions is the contract, and the contract says that the banks, whether of their own volition or if they're directed by the government, they can change these terms and conditions without any notice. Or if they're going to give notice, they basically have to publish a notice in the newspaper on the day of the change. So a lot of bank customers don't actually understand that while you are giving money to the bank, and again, so one of the things we've said in the past is a lot of people think that when you put money in the bank, you're basically, that the bank is actually, holding your money in terms of a safe custodian relationship. I mean, that's not the case. depositors are unsecured creditors of the bank, which means that technically you have lent you have given the bank a loan, and the terms of the loan that you've given the bank via your deposit is these terms and conditions. And the terms and conditions basically say we can, freeze your account, we can shut your account, we can change the rules of this contract if we're under financial distress in terms of financial crisis, or if we are directed by government. So now, obviously, a lot of people, particularly on social media, were quite shocked by Trudeau's inaction. So in terms of his implementation of the Emergencies Act, and like you said, this freezing of bank accounts in Canada, that has been now rescinded. But they're in terms of being able to manage your cash flow requirements and obviously preserve your wealth. We all need to use the banks, particularly in the modern age, given how digital the economy is. But there is something to be said about holding some reserves of physical cash, but also having other tangible assets like gold and silver out of the banking system, so that if something were to go awry, you actually have the means to be able to survive and flourish. And one of the examples I'll say is that in terms of Lebanon, the Lebanese economy in the last couple of years has gone through turmoil as the pound has crashed. So basically, I think in 2019, the Lebanese government was the second largest indebted government when you look at debt to GDP. Then when the pandemic started, a lot of their foreign creditors out of Europe basically lost confidence that the Lebanese could pay back their loans. That led to money being withdrawn from the Lebanese financial system. The Lebanese pound crashed. The banking system was in crisis. They implemented capital controls, which was they limited the amount of withdrawals that Lebanese customers can make. And I've heard personal stories, and we're not just talking about ordinary people. We're talking in some cases extremely wealthy families in Lebanon. They had most of their life savings in the banking system, and they were only allowed to get, say, $200 a day in terms of the banks, even though they may have a account balance of more than $1 million. So the risks around the banking system and how that can change one's life, that can change on a dime, and obviously people need to be cognizant of that. And I remember, I think we did an interview maybe even in 2018 when we talked about The Sound of Music and the Von Trapp family. The Von Trapps, Captain Von Trapp had most of his wealth in the Austrian banks, and when that went belly up, he basically, the Von Trapp family became destitute, and that's the real reason the children actually sang, because they were desperate for money. So having cash, tangible assets out of the banking system, so that you can mitigate any in terms of financial crisis or any government policy. That I think is just prudent planning that all Australians should do. And obviously, I think Trudeau and what he did in the last fortnight has just given people another reminder of the importance of not putting all of your eggs in one basket.
Scary days ahead, Darryl.
Yes.
I think, unfortunately, but if you look after yourself and you have a percentage of silver and gold outside of the banking system, makes a lot life easier.
Yeah, sure does. An alternative form of currency.
Yeah, absolutely.
John, you would know that I have, or Brian and myself have a healthy respect for a gentleman by the name of Egon von Greyerz, and we refer to Egon regularly. And you and I and Brian have been fortunate enough to have caught up with Egon on a number of occasions and had healthy conversations with him. And I want to refer to an article that Egon wrote just recently. And one of his subheadings was "Gold will soon be a must-have asset." Now, I read on further. A lot of this, Brian and I and yourself we talk about it all the time. But he's confirmed that in 1960, investable gold was 5% of world financial assets. And today it's between 0.5 and 0.7 of 1%. So as he says, and I'm reading this as he's presented, investors' love for booming stock, bond and property markets has resulted in gold being a forgotten and irrelevant asset. Now, this is in spite of, and we're going to be talking about this very shortly, this is in spite of gold being the best performing asset class in this century, with gold having outperformed the Dow ex-dividends by a factor of 2 times.
Yeah.
Staggering. But as he said, this will soon change. Gold is on its way. I agree with him. He goes on to say the Fed has a conundrum with the imminent crash of bubble assets, and in particular the coming stock market crash. With inflation at a 40-year high, we just noted the inflation in the United States at the moment, the new numbers were 7.5%. And real inflation well above the published figures. Any significant QE would create further inflation, also explode the already ginormous Fed balance sheet of $9 trillion, leading to a collapse of the dollar. Now, we haven't got a lot more to go, but there's some really good information here. So he then says the Fed will not save the stock market investors. This time he said stock market investors will not be saved by the Fed, and all the dip buyers will hemorrhage, as any market correction will be brief as stocks crash to ever lower lows. He then goes on to say the Fed will lose control of interest rates. Another nightmare scenario for the Fed is that the interest cycle has bottomed, with a Fed debt of $9 trillion, a federal debt of $30 trillion, and total US debt of $86 trillion. The bankrupt US can ill afford any increase in rates. And finally, he goes on to say, what the Fed doesn't understand is they can never forecast anything with any degree of accuracy, is that higher and uncontrollable rates will eventually kill the US economy. Yes, the Fed will be forced to unlimited QE to try to save the country. But this time, the new worthless dollars will also make the old dollars worth zero, and this will be the end of another previously great empire. No surprise, of course, for students of history, since every empire and every currency has crashed into total oblivion. In periods of crisis, of course, like this, gold has always looked after its holders and will do so again. John, your thoughts on Egon's remarks?
Well, what I would say, Darryl, is, I mean, there are parts of it that I would disagree with Egon. So obviously, when we talk about a stock market crash, now, kind of like I was saying before, the elite are not going to allow the financial system to crash, because that means that they lose their political power. Now, if we did see the interest rates start to go up, now, and obviously I've made the assumption that rates are going to go up in a controlled manner. If it is in a controlled manner, will the stock market fall? It will, and it could fall, say, 10 to 20%. But I don't think it's going to be a 90% crash, which would happen if we had a full-on financial meltdown. Now, could it be that interest rates start to elevate in an uncontrolled fashion? I mean that's potentially so, but we were at this point in 2019 with the repo crisis, and the banks, and I should say with the repo crisis, Darryl, is the US Federal Reserve were basically pumped in $750 billion, and there was hardly any mention in terms of the mainstream media. So they did it very quietly because they didn't want to raise panic. So I mean, I have no doubt that whether it's by obvious means, like for example in March 2020, the central banks were very public about what they were doing, and they did a number of press conferences to announce we're doing QE to infinity. And obviously then say September 2019 with the repo crisis, they did it very quietly. So I have no doubt that if the system is teetering on collapse, they will try to inject more and more money. Now, in terms of what is the impact on the US dollar, it is true to say that some currencies in the last few years have collapsed because foreign creditors in particular have lost confidence in that currency, and that currency has been dumped. So whether it's the Turkish lira or the Lebanese pound, or if we look at Venezuela or some of the countries in South America, we can see some isolated examples, particularly in the developing world. Now, when it comes to the US dollar, to my mind, for the US dollar to be dumped and for the world reserve currency to be disbanded, you probably need a very deliberate plan in order to make that happen, and a whole host of countries need to be able to join in that plan. So, for example, now, if the reserves of governments and the central banks, if they dump the dollar and they were to buy huge volumes of gold, that would obviously have a significant impact on the dollar, and obviously the financial flows between countries would be settled in something, it would be settled in gold or another currency compared to the dollar. But then obviously, we've seen in the past attempts by oil producing countries trying to, because the strength of the US dollar, it comes from two ways. It's the central banks holding these reserves, and this is at the heart of the banking system, which is called SWIFT. So SWIFT is the system that basically allows banks across the world and countries to be able to settle in terms of cross-border bank transactions. And even, for example, in the last 24 hours, Biden wanted to cut the Russians from the SWIFT system, and the Germans, the Italians, and the Hungarians basically said no. So if you started to see countries move away from this, say, SWIFT system, if they started to hold reserves in gold, and we have seen aggressive buying by some central banks in terms of adding more and more gold to their reserves. But for example, in terms of, say, Australia, in terms of the RBA, we haven't bought any additional gold, and we continue to hold a lot of our foreign currency reserves still in terms of US dollars. So we haven't really seen that movement away from the dollar in terms of reserves yet. But the other way that the American dollar gets its strength is by it is the currency in which commodity transactions are settled in, particularly in terms of gold. Particularly in terms of oil. So the oil market is settled particularly in US dollars, and that's what they call the petrodollar system. So as more and more dollars are printed, as the oil price goes higher, well, how do you keep these dollars valuable? How do you keep them in demand? You basically make all oil transactions have to be settled in terms of US dollars, and that's how you keep the demand for the currency. So there have been attempts by various oil producing countries to settle their oil transactions in something other than the US dollars. And Saddam Hussein in early 2000 wanted to switch from the US dollar to the euro, and lo and behold, a few years later, he was invaded. Then you had Gaddafi in Libya, who was trying to create what they called the African dinar, which was a African regional currency backed by gold. And what happened? He was removed from power. So if there was an attempt to dislodge the dollar from the oil market, that will be faced with financial but also military reaction. Now, there are some countries that have been successful to some degree in terms of trading oil with something other than dollars, and so the Chinese and the Iranians have been trading oil with the yuan, and they've been settling some transactions in gold as well. But you would really need many more countries, particularly European countries, to start dumping the dollar in terms of energy transactions as well as foreign reserves for the dollar to collapse. So what Egon is saying in theory is true, and there are historical precedents for that to happen. But do I see anything imminent in, say, the next 12 months where the US dollar is going to be dumped? The evidence that I can see that doesn't support that thesis. So I think in the short to medium term, the US dollar will still be the world's reserve currency. But ultimately, at some point, confidence will start to wane. But when confidence does wane, you need a group of countries to start saying, okay, we're going to buy and sell oil in something other than the US dollar. And then you need a whole host of central banks to say, we're going to hold our reserves in something other than the US dollar. And that hasn't happened yet.
Makes a lot of common sense.
Yeah, no. Good point. Good points. I guess everybody's looking at this stack that we have in front of us here, Brian, and I'm really responding to a number of the comments that were made by Egon von Greyerz, and that is that gold has been somewhat overlooked. We've gone from 5% basically 5% of the investments in gold globally to around 0.5 to 0.7 of 1%. Overlooked, and I know why. I mean, you have a look at real estate, stocks, bonds. They're all marketed very heavily by governments, by mainstream media, and there's a lot of money in it for all of them.
They're very taxable.
Correct, 100%. So, but what we want to do right now, Brian, of course, is share some points with our viewers and our subscribers and talk about this stack that we've got here, because over the last 20 years, interestingly enough, gold has outperformed stocks, bonds and real estate aggressively. So our illustration is gold versus real estate. What I want to do really is talk about an investment in gold of around half a million, just to support what I'm saying, $500,000 worth of gold. And some people would say, well, that's a lot of money to invest. Yes, it is. But there are a lot of people out there, of course, that invest in properties, and they may have one property at $500,000 or 10 properties at $500,000. But so that's why I've selected that number. But it could be at $50,000 or $10,000. It doesn't matter. But let's start with $500,000, and in gold, and let's leave it put aside for 5 years. Gold has averaged 27.1% over the last 20 years, since 2000. So let's be conservative and call it 20%. So if you had an increase of 20% over a 5-year period, your $500,000 would now be worth $1 million in gold. Now you could liquidate at that point at 20% per annum. Infinitum. You would have less gold at the end of each year, but if the growth rate was 27.1%, I believe it'll be more than that over the next 20 years, because I think our economy is in a much worse, and I'm sure John would agree, where our economy is in a much worse position now than it has been for the last 20 years. So you could liquidate, let's keep that in mind, 20% per annum, and you could have less gold, but it'll be worth more
value
at the end of each year from that point onwards. Lovely retirement. Now, so what we've got here, now this looks a little bit like a house. We thought we did a pretty good job with it, didn't we, Mark? But this is $1 million worth of gold. Perth Mint, 1 ounce gold bars. How convenient's that? You got $1 million sitting in front of you. You don't have to go out and buy a house, no maintenance, none of those things, no stamp duty, none of those things. So let's compare it to the house, what we've got here. If you had a house at $500,000, and let's say it grew at the rate of 20% per annum, which would be a fantastic 5-year period. But let's say it did that, you'd have $1 million property, wouldn't you?
Yes, certainly would.
Okay. So what would the return be on that $1 million property? Something like $40,000 if it was a rental property, about $40,000 a year before outgoings. Then let's consider you've got other costs incurred, council rates, of course, and you've got maintenance and major renos and all of that. So let's say that the return was more like $30,000 a year. So we're talking $200,000 a year with a gold investment.
20%, yeah.
20%, $200,000 a year, infinitum, compared to a $30,000 a year return on a property investing the same amount. Now, to me, that's outstanding. And I learnt these numbers many years ago from a gentleman by the name of Peter Daniels, who shared that with me. And Brian and I, of course, took advantage of that wonderful information, and we've been saving in precious metals ever since. But Brian has something that we can add to that part of the presentation, just to highlight the real value in gold.
Yeah, look, I put the figures together and what we've just been talking about, but I took it over an extension of 50 years, and that's in fact from 1971 when we actually went off the gold standard worldwide. So between 1971 and 2021. So 50 years, and the gold price is up 52 times. So $35 an ounce in 1971, right through to $1,820 in 1921. Now, saying that, it's already up to 1900 a couple of months later, in 2022. So, but 50 years, 52 times. Now, I relate it to my Adelaide home. It's around about 10 minutes from here, and in my Adelaide home is 10 minutes from the CBD of Adelaide, and in the early 70s was valued at approximately 60,000 Australian dollars. If I multiply that by 52 times, we come to a figure of around 3.1 million for my home. Now, the present value, with lots of care and maintenance, it's going on all the time, it never stops, right? And extensions is approximately, right now, my home is valued at between 1.2 and 1.3 million. So you can see that slightly less than the 20%. Gold and silver, for that matter, has turned out to be a better purchase with no maintenance. Over time, precious metals will outshine because you cannot print gold. You can print money, and that's where the inflation starts. There you go.
No, look, it just makes so much sense. And hey, we can only, right now, more than any other time in history, it's important to have an alternative form of currency.
Yeah, we don't say you don't have real estate as an investment. Absolutely not. But you put a proportion back into silver and gold, and you'll get a reality check of how good it is to have it.
Once again, we talk about a balanced portfolio.
Absolutely.
That's really what we're saying.
Yeah.
John. Thank you once again. Thank you once again, John. I think our time is almost up, but look, the support from John over the last 3+ years now has been exceptional. It's just been a privilege to have John on the team at As Good as Gold Australia, and we'd love to think that that's going to continue for many years to come. But what I want to do before we say goodbye is refer to a gentleman by the name of Charlie Jones. Charlie Jones, in 10 years' time, he was a motivational speaker, but he'd say in 10 years' time, you'll be in exactly the same position you're in right now, apart from two things: the people you meet and the books you read. Brian and I have gone out of our way, but it's been a wonderful ride.
It's a wonderful journey.
To connect with people who can advance us, make us better than we were before we met them. Life is a learning process, and you need to connect with people that can educate you and take you to the next level. John, of course, is one of those people. So, John, just following on from what Charlie Jones said, if somebody wanted to connect with John Adams and talk economics, gold, silver, how would they best do that? How could they make contact with you?
The easiest way is in terms of my email address. I've got a couple of emails, john@adamseconomics.com, and then we have john@asgoodasgoldaustralia.com as well. I'm on social media. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Telegram. People can reach out to me on those platforms as well. I'm on Facebook as well. So there are multiple ways to connect. The other easy way to do is obviously ring Darryl and Brian or the team As Good as Gold and say, I'd like to speak to John Adams, and I'm sure both of you and the team will put those people in contact with me, and we're happy to connect.
I'm sure we would. But a wonderful opportunity to be. I mean, John worked with the Australian government for many years as an economic advisor. The opportunity to connect with somebody like John could be very fulfilling, very rewarding. Thank you for that, John. And look, I guess we can just finish by saying, or referring to Peter Daniels once again. Peter would say, I do not care what poorly executed economic decisions are made in the world tonight, tomorrow I will still be able to party. Why could he say that? Because he invested heavily into gold, provided him with all sorts of options and alternative currency. Peter today is a billionaire with a B because of the decisions that he's made through life. And Egon, of course, we make reference to Egon regularly and spoke a bit about him tonight. Mm-hmm. But Egon has a famous quote. He has many, but one of which is?
Well, the quote goes something like this, right? How much money do you put into gold? I should say, how much currency do you put into gold, right? Whatever you can't afford to lose. So just remind yourself of that. If you don't want to lose, right, gold and silver, other metals to place your currency.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, John. Thank you to our viewers and subscribers as well. We thank you very much for supporting this channel on an ongoing basis. So until next time, all of you, stay well, stay focused, and goodbye for now.
Goodbye for now.